Death Note effortlessly walks a line that I think many shows struggle with, a line that lies between immediate consequence and meaningful conflict. So, if I think there's a line, I'd better start by explaining what I think lies on either side. On the one side, there are immediate consequences. There is a difference between eventual consequences and immediate consequences. Too long between action and consequence will leave a story that feels either predictable or slow. Too short a period between the two, on the other hand, undermines what I think lies on the other side of that line, meaningful conflict. Here I could simply use conflict, but conflict for conflict's sake is typically very dull. Again, in order to create that meaning, there needs to be a certain amount of time dedicated to developing that conflict. As a bit of a side note, I will mention here that these two elements in a narrative are often subverted for the sake of humour. See Indiana Jones and his conflict with this guy. The quick resolution and somewhat disappointing end to the conflict is the whole point of the scene. See also every fight in One Punch Man, played as a joke to a similar effect. They could have called it One Joke Man, but that's not fair, original, or relevant. Before going any further, I have to outline the major conflicts and the consequences of what occurs during those conflicts. To be very clear, I'm talking about the anime, not the manga, and especially not the Netflix movie, which I already discussed in a previous video, linked via the card above. This is also the point where you should probably leave if you haven't watched the anime. So here's a heads up, there are major spoilers ahead in this video. First, I'll outline the major conflicts as I see them. The most obvious is the conflict between Light and L. It's the conflict that most immediately comes to mind for most fans of the show. One of the more obvious conflicts that is perhaps less well liked is that between Nier and Mello. I think this one was less well established because the goal was set up between them at a point where most fans weren't very interested. We didn't really care who would take up L's mantle when we were still just reeling from his death. So, let it be noted that I'm not saying the show is always perfect. There are also a lot of smaller conflicts that, for me at least, are part of what sets Death Note apart. The conflict between Rem and Light is fascinating. The conflict between Soichiro and L is wonderful, and the conflict between Naomi Misora and Light might just be my favourite part of the whole series. There are a lot of other minor conflicts I could mention, and I haven't even mentioned the conflicts that occur within a character. Aizawa's conflict within himself over remaining in the task force leads to a memorably emotional moment in a series that can come across as cold. Soichiro's struggle between the roles of detective and father made his arc one of the great tragedies of the series. But I've got to stop somewhere. So what about consequences then? With each conflict, there are potential consequences and the eventual consequence. In order not to waste your time, I'm only going to discuss the eventual consequences in depth, but it's important to note that, for example, L's death wasn't inevitably set up by Light and L's confrontation, but rather one of their deaths was. L's death was the eventual consequence, but the death of either Light or L was the potential consequence. Bear these distinctions in mind as I go forward. So, obviously L's death was one of the major consequences in the series, but there are certainly many others. The eventual consequence of Nier and Mello's competition was their compromise, which eventually led to Light's capture and subsequent death. As a brief side note, I think this may have been another reason people have issues with the final third of the series. Nier and Mello's conflict was the real reason Light was finally caught, not actually Nier's conflict with Light. Nier and Mello weren't even particularly interested in catching Kira so much as catching Kira before the other could do the same. But I'm getting off track here. The eventual consequence of Rem challenging Light is her death. The consequence of Soichiro's conflict with L sees him voluntarily imprisoned before eventually confronting his own son to prove his innocence. In what is perhaps the most tragic moment for any character in this series, the consequence of Misora's chance meeting with Light is her death. Okay, so there are consequences that arise from the conflicts within the show. What's so special about that? Well, nothing. Every show has conflicts and consequences, no matter how minor. What is special though, is how they are handled. L's death has to be the starting point here, for his death was incredible. Not just because it was so hard to believe as it happened. Not just because such a wonderful character's death was so utterly without ceremony, but because the conclusion to his arc, The consequence of confronting Light was so immediate. In a lesser show, such a character's death, a character who was so central to the series, and how unceremoniously that death arrived, would have given the audience a sort of whiplash the show couldn't recover from. Of course, there are people who did in fact stop watching after his death, but I don't think that could have been avoided, nor could his death have been handled any better. At the outset of this video, I claim Death Note walked a line most shows struggle with, a line between meaningful conflict and immediate consequence. L was developed enough that his conflict with Light mattered. He wasn't a throwaway character, which only made it all the more shocking when he did, in fact, die. In a nutshell, his conflict with Light lasted long enough that it was truly meaningful, but his end came immediately enough that his death was still surprising. L's death is, in my eyes, the perfect on-screen death. It had significance for the time spent with the character beforehand, and impact for having cut that time short. But one good moment does not a show make. So what other moments walk that line? Soichiro Yagami, one of the few moral centers of the show, has an ongoing conflict with L, a conflict that ties into his torn loyalties between his role as a father and his role as a detective. Throughout the series, the conflict between the two roles, and the conflict between Yagami and L, isn't ever wholly resolved. But this, in my eyes, is another great example of the balance within the show, albeit to a different effect this time. As Soichiro's roles as both father and detective are challenged by L, we are invited into a conflict that would see Soichiro choose between the two. Were he to do either, the show's balance would surely be ruined, and so we see L die before that conflict comes to a head. L's death leaves other conflicts unresolved, adding weight to his death that is felt long after his final moments. If that lack of resolution seems unsatisfying, I would counter that, because during this conflict we see two major choices that Soichiro makes in order to maintain these two conflicting values. First, a choice as father to have himself imprisoned, and then as detective to stake his life that neither Light nor Misa were Kira. Worth noting here is that both roles can be considered to support either decision. This is just my personal interpretation. Part of Death Note's brilliance is knowing when to hold back from a final consequence, to leave the audience unresolved and the moral questions such a conflict asks unanswered. There are a lot of moments that come to exemplify what Death Note is, but as a final example, I want to discuss Naomi Misura. She's introduced in a way that would typically be reserved for a major character. Indeed, in a sense she is a major character, just not one with the screen time you'd typically expect. She is first introduced as the partner of Rei Penba, and after Penba is killed, she realizes that Kira can kill with methods other than a heart attack. Add on to that a past experience working under L on another case, and you're primed to expect that she will be both a major character and a recurring one. As she attempts to contact the task force to tell them what she has discovered, she meets Light, who eventually convinces her to reveal her name, with the promise of becoming a member of the task force. The very same expectation that her introduction primes us to expect from her character. And as an immediate consequence of revealing her name, she is killed. The conflict is significant because the stakes are high. Misura will die when she reveals her name, and Light will be caught if she doesn't. The consequences, though, are so immediate, and the potential held in Misura's narrative is so great that her death is legitimately tragic. It's like the tragic inverse of the Indiana Jones scene I mentioned earlier. Even those three moments hardly seem special, though. Every one of those moments has its parallels in other shows. So why did I spend so much time discussing them? Well, the final element that sets Death Note apart is the way in which it sets up new conflicts and consequences throughout the series, how each conflict seamlessly interacts with and leads to the next, and how each consequence affects not merely the conflict it arose from, but also the conflicts that otherwise seemed only tenuously related. I spent so much time discussing these three moments because I think it's important to bear in mind the individual significance of Death Note's conflicts when I attempt to paint a view of how they're all laid out together in the next half of this video. So, let's have a look at how these consequences and conflicts play out over the series until L's death. Why up until then? Well, this video is already way too long, and the conflicts are more easily plotted out before L's death. Oh, and so this video doesn't extend to a ridiculous length, I'm focusing on the main conflicts and the major consequences. I'm not looking to make an episode by episode plot summary here, although it might sound like that at times. In episode 1, we have Light's conflict within himself. First, whether to believe in the notebook, and then whether to use it, and finally, who to use it on. That's just the first half of the episode, the consequence of which is that Light develops a very literal God complex in order to justify his own twisted morality. In this first episode, the conflicts are largely self-contained, and the consequences are immediate. This is the sort of thing you tend to see in a lot of pilots. They act as a self-contained introduction to the rest of the show. What follows in episodes 2 through 25 is where I think Death Note really starts to stand out. In episode 2, Light is confronted by L. Thus begins the single biggest conflict of the series that only ends when L dies in episode 25. This is a long conflict, a significant one, but not unsatisfactory or dull for its length, given the smaller conflicts that litter the show in between its inception and its eventual consequence. In episode 3, it's revealed Light is being followed by an FBI agent, Ray Penber, the identity of whom is discovered in episode 4 and who was killed as a result in episode 5. From episode 5, Penber's partner, Naomi Misura, is seeking to catch Kira for her partner's death. In episode 6, she meets Light by chance and dies as a result in episode 7. While this is going on, the Japanese police are meeting with L in episodes 6 and 7, itself a resolution to the rising tensions between the Japanese police and L that had been going on from episodes 3 to 5. This is one of those instances where one conflict affects the consequences of another. Because the remaining police weren't at Task Force headquarters, Naomi Misura ended up dead. In episode 8, L puts Light's room and household under surveillance, beginning the conflict between Soichiro Yagami and L, as well as the first major introduction of a conflict between his roles as father and detective, the former ending with L's death in episode 25, and the latter shortly afterwards. I'm going to lump them together here for the sake of convenience, but they are both very important. In episode 9, L confronts Light directly. From here on until L's death, there are the conflicts between Light and L as both the ideas they represent and as individual people. They are quite different, so I'm marking it as a separate conflict, even if it could be considered part of the same conflict. This, again, carries forward until L's death. In episode 10, we have tennis. Very important, that. Episode 11 introduces a second Kira who has an ongoing conflict with the task force. Because this one ends up becoming more or less part of the same extended conflict between Light and L, I'm not adding anything new here, but it is worth noting that it does happen. Episode 11 also introduces a conflict between Light's moral standards and those of Sakura TV. Once again, I'm not adding anything to this diagram, as this conflict is rather messy and only appears sporadically. In episode 12, the second Kira is introduced as a problem for Light, and Light's conflict with this second Kira begins, ending in episode 13 when Misa tracks down Light and reveals herself as the second Kira. In episode 14, the conflict between Light and Rem is introduced via her promise to kill Light the moment he puts Misa in danger. Again, this conflict is resolved with the deaths of Rem and L in episode 25. The 15th episode introduces a bunch of developments within the conflicts I've mentioned previously, but doesn't really begin or end any of these conflicts, so I'm not adding anything to this diagram. Episode 16 is much the same. Stuff is definitely happening, but we're seeing the setup for the Yotsuba arc, not any of the individual conflicts therein. In episode 17, the Yotsuba arc is properly introduced, and Rem's distaste for the members of Yotsuba. I'm combining the two again here under the banner of the conflict between the task force and the Yotsuba group, which concludes in episode 24. Episode 18 introduces Aizawa's conflict within his desires to remain in the task force and to hold a job to support his family, concluding with a revelation he was conducting his own investigation before rejoining the task force in episode 23. The 19th episode sees a bunch of things happen, the main conflict of which I'll just lump under Matsuda as a title. Matsuda's internal conflict between his perceived inadequacies and his desire to assist in the Kira investigation are later resolved when he agrees to appear on Sakura TV in order to lure out Higuchi in episode 22. Episodes 20 to 24 wrap up the Yotsuba arc, While minor conflicts are introduced, like those between the individuals within Yotsuba, none are on the level of those mentioned thus far. These episodes are concerned with the Yotsuba arc and providing a minor victory for L and his team before Light's major victory is revealed. Episode 25 then sees the fruition of that victory, in the deaths of L and Rem, the two biggest threats to him at that point. Okay, so what's my point? He asks rhetorically. Well, a lot of shows can make one or the other work well. You could have consequences or resolutions on a regular basis, making each episode feel more self-contained, or perhaps a show with lengthier conflicts that feel more significant as a result. Both can serve up fine television, but when you strike a balance between the two, you get something special. The difference between striking a balance and just favouring one or the other can be illustrated in the first 2 seasons of The Walking Dead. Season 2 had major pacing issues because it stuck far too long on the one situation, on the conflict between Rick and Herschel, before introducing any consequences for that conflict. It became stale and predictable before the eventual conclusion, even though that eventual conclusion was actually not bad. The first season, however, had conflicts that were resolved in 1 or 2 episodes, all while building major conflicts that would extend to the end of the first season or beyond, an approach I greatly prefer. Death Note's tight writing makes the first season of The Walking Dead look like the work of amateurs though. Here is a series that is so consistently introducing new conflicts and resolving old ones that there's almost no time to breathe. Look at how the major conflicts are spaced out here. The vast majority of episodes introduce something new or offer a conclusion to something old, and those that don't do either have more than one major conflict running at once. Just Right made a great video on Death Note's pacing, which I'll link in the description and via the card above, but it's worth stating again that its pacing is pretty much peerless. Of course, fast pacing wouldn't matter if the conflicts, consequences and narrative beats of the show didn't land, and they absolutely do. I feel the need to temper my enthusiasm just a touch here, because it's not perfect. As I mentioned in an earlier video, I do have issues with the way certain characters are handled, and the at times unbearably over-the-top style with which even mundane activities are rendered. There's also the occasional attempted comic relief that feels a little out of place, and Misa as a whole.
I mean, I know that Light trusts me totally, but don't you think most people would start saying I'm cheating on him? Oh, he'd be so jealous.
Nier and the others told me that this woman's supposed to be the second Kira, but could it really be this unbelievably stupid girl?
Just everything with Misa. Overall though, I think it's pretty brilliant. And in maintaining a balance between immediate consequences and meaningful conflict, the show achieves something pretty special. Something I clearly thought was worth celebrating, given I just wrote 3,000 words doing just that. But hey, that's just my take on the series. I'd love to know what you think. What makes Death Note special in your eyes? Is it even special at all? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers, have a good one.